The Fool's Errand: Why Canada's Action Will Have No Effect on Global Climate. A fool's errand is a task or activity that has no hope of success. Climate change is a global issue. The alleged causes and effects occur in all countries and can only be addressed by all countries. Federal, provincial, and municipal governments in Canada are now spending billions of taxpayers' dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Yet Canada produces only 1.5% of global GHG emissions. So even completely eliminating emissions here in Canada would have little effect on the world. Advocates of climate alarm make four main claims. People believe that all countries are allied in a United Nations-led effort to reduce and eventually eliminate GHG emissions. They believe that this effort, which has been going on for over 30 years, has successfully reduced emissions. They believe that based on the actions that have been taken and those likely to be taken, emissions will be largely eliminated by about 2050. 27 conferences of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have been held since 1990. Yet greenhouse gas emissions increased 60% from 1990 to 2019, and after a short pause during the pandemic, have continued their steady rise. This graph shows the resulting increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. What has changed since 1990 is the regional shares of the emissions. As this graph illustrates, emissions in the wealthier countries have either stabilized or declined due to the expenditure of trillions of dollars on renewable energy and new energy technologies. Emissions in the developing countries, in contrast, have sharply increased. As of 2022, they constituted 68% of the world total. China alone produces 30% of world's emissions, almost as much as all the developed countries put together. The media misrepresents what is stated in the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 2015 Paris Agreement. The media repeatedly and incorrectly has described these agreements as creating binding national commitments to reduce emissions, but they don't do that. The Paris Agreement commits countries only to submit voluntary 5-year plans as to how they will reduce emissions. There are no legally binding international commitments to reduce emissions and no legal penalties for failing to do so. In fact, the Framework Convention explicitly acknowledges that the developing countries will place increasing their economic development and improving the living standards of their populations above the goal of reducing GHG emissions. Many organizations attempt to project future GHG emissions based on estimates of how the world's population and economy will grow. By 2050, there will be 2 billion more people than today, and Asia and Africa will hold 80% of the world population. Further, income per capita in the developing countries will more than double. These two trends alone will far override the effects of technological changes in energy production and consumption. The U.S. Energy Information Administration is probably the most authoritative source of projections. Its 2023 International Energy Outlook includes these graphs and projects GHG emissions to grow from about 35 billion tons of CO2 equivalent to about 43 billion tons. These 3 slides are from the EIA Outlook. The developing nations have insisted that any commitments they make to reducing emissions will depend on the wealthier countries providing large amounts of technological and financial aid. How much? They want $1.3 trillion per year from 2026 to 2030 for mitigation and $600 billion per year for adaptation, plus an unlimited amount for so-called loss and damages or reparations due to historic emissions. The wealthier countries will never agree to pay that much. Countries cannot even agree on who will pay or who will receive payments. This will be a major source of contention at COP28, the conference to be held in Dubai in November and December 2023. Here's what that kind of money looks like. In the far upper left-hand corner, you see $1 million in packets of 10,000 of $100 bills, and then it's extrapolated out to 100 million, 1 billion, and 1 trillion. In conclusion, global greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, not decreasing, mostly due to growth in the developing countries. There is no global energy transition. Developing countries value improving the access of their people to modern energy systems and higher standards of living. What Canadians do or think has no influence. No matter how much Canada spends or how many sacrifices Canadians make on the altar of climate policy, nothing we do will affect future global temperatures or climate. The results will be too small to measure. We must decide how much we are prepared to spend on symbolic sacrifices that have no practical effects. Climate activists may be prepared to spend their money on symbolic sacrifices, but these costs should not be imposed on Canadian taxpayers. It's a fool's errand. Don't be a fool.